It's a pattern so predictable, it's become a cultural cliché. A relationship progresses smoothly, connection deepens, and just when everything seems to be moving toward commitment, he pulls away. The withdrawal happens so abruptly, it leaves you questioning everything: your attractiveness, your judgment, even your sanity. What causes this perplexing retreat at the very threshold of intimacy? Sigmund Freud, for all his controversial theories, identified a psychological mechanism that explains this common experience with uncanny accuracy. He observed that humans unconsciously sabotage what they most desire when getting close to attaining it, particularly in matters of love. This contradiction, wanting connection while simultaneously fleeing from it, reveals the complex ambivalence that shapes male emotional patterns in particular ways. The phenomenon isn't about games or manipulation. It stems from a fundamental psychological conflict that intensifies precisely when emotional intimacy reaches a critical threshold. Understanding this pattern doesn't excuse hurtful behavior, but it illuminates what happens in the male psyche when love transitions from possibility to reality. Freud recognized that our earliest experiences of attachment create templates that shape all future relationships. For men, these early experiences interact with cultural expectations about masculinity to create specific vulnerabilities around intimacy. When a man begins to fall in love, these vulnerabilities suddenly become activated, triggering defensive responses that often manifest as emotional withdrawal. The male retreat from intimacy typically occurs at a precise psychological moment when the relationship shifts from the idealization phase to deeper, more authentic connection. During idealization, both partners present curated versions of themselves. This selectivity feels safe, but as genuine intimacy develops, the protective filters dissolve. Suddenly, the prospect of being truly seen, with all one's flaws and vulnerabilities, triggers profound anxiety. This anxiety has specific roots in masculine psychological development. From early childhood, many boys receive consistent cultural messages that vulnerability equals weakness. While girls are generally encouraged to develop emotional fluency, boys often learn to suppress emotional expression, except for culturally sanctioned feelings like anger. This emotional stunting creates adults who experience intimacy as simultaneously desirable and threatening. The timing of the withdrawal is psychologically predictable. It typically happens not when things are going poorly, but precisely when the relationship shows promise of deep fulfillment. This paradox makes perfect sense through Freud's understanding of how the unconscious mind operates. What we consciously desire can trigger unconscious fears about what fulfilling that desire might mean. For men specifically, several unconscious fears activate as love deepens. First comes fear of engulfment, the anxiety that intimate connection will somehow consume one's independence and identity. This fear isn't rational but visceral, stemming from early experiences where dependency and autonomy were in conflict. Many men unconsciously equate emotional merging with a loss of self, triggering a defensive retreat precisely when connection feels most promising. The second fear involves vulnerability. Genuine love requires lowering psychological defenses, exposing one's authentic self rather than the carefully constructed persona most people present to the world. For men raised to equate vulnerability with weakness, this exposure feels profoundly threatening. The closer they come to authentic intimacy, the more intense this discomfort becomes. Perhaps most powerful is the fear of inadequacy. As romantic connection deepens, the fantasy of perfection dissolves. Both partners begin to recognize each other's flaws and limitations. For men who have internalized cultural pressure to be perpetually strong, competent, and in control, the prospect of being seen as imperfect can trigger shame so intense that withdrawal feels like the only safe response. Freud was particularly insightful about the connection between intimacy fears and early parental relationships. A boy's relationship with his mother creates his first template for intimate connection with women. This relationship varies widely. Some mothers are emotionally intrusive, others distant, some consistent, others unpredictable. Each pattern creates specific expectations about what happens when one gets close to a woman. The mother-son relationship that most commonly creates intimacy, avoidance, is one where love felt conditional or unpredictable. If a boy learned that maternal affection could be withdrawn based on his behavior or emotions, he develops an unconscious expectation that romantic love will follow the same pattern. The fear that, if she truly knows me, she'll reject me, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as he rejects her first. Fathers shape this dynamic too, though differently. Boys learn how to navigate relationships with women partly by observing their fathers. A father who remained emotionally distant from his partner models this behavior as normal masculine relationship conduct. Conversely, witnessing a father who was emotionally present and vulnerable with his partner creates a template that makes intimacy feel safer. Male socialization compounds these individual dynamics. From early childhood, many boys receive consistent messaging that emotional dependency is unmanly. They learn to establish identity through separation rather than connection. When romantic love begins to dissolve the boundaries between self and other, it conflicts with these deeply ingrained beliefs about masculine identity. These patterns emerge most strongly at specific developmental stages. During adolescence, many young men learn to approach romance through the lens of conquest rather than connection. Success with women becomes tied to masculine identity, but actual emotional intimacy remains frightening territory. This creates adults who can initiate relationships skillfully, but struggle when those relationships deepen past a certain point. What's particularly interesting is how unconscious these patterns remain. The man who pulls away when things get serious rarely understands his own behavior. He experiences vague discomfort, sudden doubts, or an inexplicable need for space. What he doesn't recognize is that these feelings emerge precisely because the relationship threatens unconscious beliefs about himself and about love. The timing of withdrawal often coincides with relationship milestones that symbolize deeper commitment. Meeting family members, discussing future plans, or experiencing moments of unusual emotional closeness can all trigger retreat. These thresholds represent points where fantasy must give way to reality, where idealization ends and the more challenging work of genuine intimacy begins. Neurologically, this pattern makes perfect sense. The brain processes emotional threats in the same regions that process physical danger. For someone whose early experiences taught them that emotional vulnerability leads to pain, intimacy triggers the same neurological alarm systems as physical threat. The withdrawal isn't calculated but instinctive, the emotional equivalent of pulling your hand from a hot stove. What makes this pattern particularly confusing is that it doesn't reflect the man's conscious desires. He may genuinely want closeness and commitment, while simultaneously being driven by unconscious fears to sabotage these very goals. This internal conflict creates the mixed signals that leave partners bewildered. The passionate pursuit, followed by inexplicable distance. Modern attachment theory provides additional insights into this pattern. People generally develop one of 4 attachment styles based on early caregiving experiences: secure, anxious, avoidant, or disorganized. Men with avoidant attachment styles, developed when caregivers were consistently unresponsive or rejected dependents, are particularly prone to pulling away when relationships deepen. Their nervous systems are programmed to equate emotional closeness with danger. The pattern is also influenced by what psychologists call approach avoidance conflict, when the same situation or person triggers both desire and fear. The closer one gets to the desired object, the more the fear intensifies. This explains why men often pull away precisely when things are going well. Proximity intensifies anxiety, eventually overwhelming the desire for connection. Interestingly, this isn't just an individual psychological pattern, but a cultural one. Many societies romantically idealize passionate pursuit, while simultaneously devaluing the skills needed for sustained intimacy. Popular culture celebrates the drama of conquest, while rarely depicting the less exciting but more rewarding work of maintained connection. Men absorb these narratives as implicit relationship models. The biological dimension adds another layer. When romantic relationships develop, bonding hormones like oxytocin increase. While often described as a love hormone, oxytocin actually intensifies both positive and negative social emotions. For someone with intimacy anxiety, rising oxytocin levels can actually increase fear and stress rather than comfort, creating a biochemical retreat response. The developmental path to healthy intimacy requires integrating these conflicting impulses. Mature love involves maintaining individual identity while allowing genuine closeness, being separate but connected. Men who haven't resolved early conflicts around dependence and independence struggle to achieve. Freud's controversial concept of repetition compulsion also illuminates this pattern. This theory suggests we unconsciously recreate painful childhood scenarios in adulthood, attempting to master what once overwhelmed us. A man who experienced rejection after showing vulnerability in childhood may unconsciously recreate this scenario in adult relationships, pulling away before he can be rejected. The physical manifestations of this psychological conflict are often visible. As intimacy deepens, men experiencing this ambivalence may show physical signs of stress, disrupted sleep, changed eating patterns, increased irritability, or heightened startle response. The body expresses what the conscious mind hasn't yet recognized, that closeness has triggered a threat response. For women experiencing a partner's withdrawal, this pattern is particularly confusing because it contradicts rational expectation. Logically, increasing emotional investment should strengthen desire for connection, not diminish it. Understanding that the withdrawal reflects internal conflict rather than diminished interest provides a crucial perspective shift. This doesn't mean women should accept or accommodate harmful patterns. Understanding the psychology behind male withdrawal isn't about excusing behavior, but about making informed choices about how to respond. Sometimes the wisest response is establishing clear boundaries or even ending relationships with partners unwilling to address their intimacy fears. For men caught in this pattern, the path forward requires developing what Freud called insight, conscious understanding of unconscious processes. This means recognizing that the impulse to pull away when things get serious reflects past conditioning rather than present reality. With this awareness, the automatic retreat response becomes a choice point rather than an inevitability. The most effective approaches for addressing this pattern involve both cognitive understanding and emotional reprogramming. Cognitively, men benefit from identifying the specific beliefs that make intimacy threatening. Beliefs about what vulnerability means, what commitments require, or how love limits freedom. These beliefs, once conscious, can be evaluated and revised. Emotionally, the work involves gradually increasing tolerance for vulnerability. This happens through experiences that contradict the expectation that openness leads to rejection or harm. Each positive experience of being accepted despite vulnerability creates new neural pathways that gradually override the old defensive programming. Communication plays a crucial role in navigating these patterns. When a man can articulate, "I'm feeling the urge to pull away right now, and I think it's because things between us are getting real," it transforms an unconscious reaction into a shared challenge. This transparency creates space for connection, even within the experience of fear. For couples, understanding these dynamics shifts the narrative from personal rejection to a shared growth opportunity. When both partners recognize that withdrawal often reflects internal struggle rather than diminished interest, they can approach the pattern with compassion rather than criticism. This doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior, but contextualizing it accurately. The timing of interventions matters. The best moment to address these patterns isn't during acute withdrawal, but when connection feels strong. During periods of closeness, couples can discuss how to handle future withdrawal episodes. This creates a framework for understanding the pattern when it emerges, rather than being blindsided by it. Some withdrawal reflects normal needs for autonomy, rather than pathological avoidance. Healthy relationships involve oscillation between closeness and independence. The difference lies in how the withdrawal is handled, whether it's communicated respectfully, whether connection is maintained during distance, and whether the pattern serves individual growth or prevents intimacy. Cultural change plays a role in addressing these patterns. As societies evolve toward more flexible gender expectations, boys encounter fewer messages equating vulnerability with weakness. This creates adults less likely to experience intimacy as threatening to masculine identity. The gradual shift toward valuing emotional intelligence in men contributes to healthier relationship dynamics. Individual therapy provides a crucial context for addressing intimacy fears. The therapeutic relationship itself offers a controlled environment for experiencing vulnerability with safety. As men learn to tolerate emotional openness with a therapist, they develop capacities that transfer to romantic relationships. Therapies specifically focused on attachment issues can be particularly effective. Couple therapy adds another dimension by addressing the relationship system rather than just individual patterns. Partners often unwittingly reinforce each other's defensive patterns. For example, when a man withdraws, his partner might respond with criticism or pursuit, inadvertently increasing his defensive retreat. Therapy helps couples recognize and interrupt these cycles. The path toward intimacy isn't about eliminating fear, but developing the capacity to feel fear without being controlled by it. This capacity, what psychologists call affect tolerance, allows men to stay present even when vulnerability triggers anxiety. The goal isn't fearlessness, but courage, the willingness to move toward connection despite fear. For women, understanding these dynamics creates space for compassionate discernment. Not all men are equally capable of or interested in addressing intimacy fears. Someone consistently unwilling to examine withdrawal patterns or dismissive of their impact may not be ready for the relationship you seek. Compassion doesn't require compromising your needs for connection. The most hopeful aspect of understanding these patterns is recognizing their malleability. While early conditioning creates powerful tendencies, neuroscience confirms that the brain remains plastic throughout life. New experiences create new neural pathways. Each positive experience of vulnerability met with acceptance literally rewires the nervous system's response to intimacy. Meaningful change happens through what psychologists call corrective emotional experiences, encounters that contradict negative expectations. When a man expects rejection after showing vulnerability, but instead experiences acceptance, it challenges core beliefs. These experiences must be repeated to override established patterns, but each one weakens the automatic withdrawal response. Ultimately, the capacity for intimate connection reflects emotional maturity rather than gender. Men aren't inherently less capable of intimacy than women, but many have received less support for developing emotional skills. Understanding withdrawal patterns as developmental challenges rather than fixed traits creates space for growth and change. The journey from intimacy avoidance to connection capacity follows a predictable trajectory. It begins with awareness, recognizing the pattern without judgment. Next comes understanding the pattern's origins and functions. Then experimentation with new responses becomes possible, gradually building confidence in the safety of closeness. This isn't a linear process, but a spiral of growth punctuated by temporary regressions. For relationships affected by these patterns, patience becomes essential. Developmental changes don't happen overnight. The defensive responses were established over years of reinforcement and require consistent contradictory experiences to change. The relevant question isn't whether withdrawal happens, but whether there's gradual movement toward greater intimacy capacity. What Freud recognized and what modern psychology confirms is that love simultaneously fulfills our deepest longings and triggers our greatest fears. The impulse to pull away when intimacy deepens isn't pathological but human. What distinguishes healthy development is the capacity to recognize this ambivalence without being governed by it, to feel the fear of closeness without letting it determine our choices. The capacity for intimate connection ultimately emerges from integration. bringing unconscious fears into conscious awareness, where they can be examined rather than automatically obeyed. This integration doesn't eliminate anxiety, but changes our relationship to it. The fear becomes information rather than command, one voice in an internal conversation rather than the decisive one. For men caught in cycles of pursuit and withdrawal, emotional freedom comes through facing rather than avoiding intimacy fears. Each step toward vulnerability, though frightening, expands capacity for connection. The reward isn't just better relationships, but internal coherence, closing the gap between what one consciously wants and unconsciously fears. For women navigating relationships with men struggling with intimacy, discernment becomes crucial. Does his pattern show gradual movement toward greater connection capacity, even with occasional retreat? Or does the withdrawal serve to maintain permanent emotional distance? This distinction separates developmental struggles from patterns unlikely to change without significant intervention. The final insight Freud offers about this pattern is both challenging and liberating. Our capacity for intimacy reflects choices as well as conditioning. While early experiences create powerful tendencies, adults retain agency to examine and revise these patterns. The man who habitually pulls away when love deepens isn't doomed to repeat this pattern unless he chooses to remain unconscious of it. This understanding transforms how we see the classic pattern of male withdrawal. As relationships deepen, what seemed like rejection reveals itself as fear, not of the partner, but of the vulnerability loving them requires. This doesn't excuse hurtful behavior, but contextualizes it, creating space for compassion alongside accountability. In that space, genuine intimacy becomes possible, not despite our fears, but through facing them together.